In looking at all the developments that occurred in the United States in the early part of the 19th century, we have seen expansion across the country with people moving. We've seen increase in transportation, communication, industrial revolution. So you can imagine living in that time period, how exciting it must have been, all these innovations coming about and all these changes occurring. Another area in which there was change was in the social realm. And some of that had to do with slavery itself. This is a painting done of a man who led a slave rebellion. His name was Nat Turner. He was a slave on a plantation, also served as the preacher in the local slave congregation. By all appearances, had a very good relationship with his master, especially with his master's daughter, a little girl, but became the person who organized the slaves on his plantation to revolt against the master. And so one night they came into the master's house and killed them all, including the little girl. And then went on a rampage from plantation to plantation, gathering up more and more slaves as they went, and killing the white people that came across, and was part of a revolt by slaves to gain their freedom. There is an excellent book written concerning him called The Confessions of Nat Turner. If you're interested, it goes through everything that happened. He eventually was caught, and he and the ringleaders were executed. Many of the slaves who were caught were simply sent back to their plantations. But this had an effect on people in both North and South. In the North, it kind of brought to their attention the plight of slaves in the South, and maybe they thought a little more about it. In the South, it had an even greater effect, because whereas previously many masters would not have thought twice about their slaves having arms, of teaching their slaves to read and write, after this, they became very fearful. And so a number of the states passed laws against even teaching a slave to read and write. Why? Well, if they can read and write, they can write messages to slaves on the plantations, and they can bring about another revolution. So in many ways, the South became more stringent, became more oppressive toward the slaves out of fear. Any questions? You understand? Now, at the same time, in the early part of the 19th century, we have a man by the name of Frederick Douglass, pictured on the left, who was an escaped slave, came to the North and began lecturing on the evils of slavery, and was advocating this relatively new social movement called abolitionism, to abolish slavery. He was such a well-spoken man that there were some who denied that he had ever been a slave. They said that's not possible. You know, he could not have been a slave and talk as well as he does. But he really was a slave, and was a very good speaker. Spoken a lot of places in northern cities. The woman on the right is Harriet Tubman. I suspect you've heard of her, have you not? Harriet Tubman. She is known for leading slaves out of their slavery in the South. Although, for as famous as she is, she didn't really lead that many slaves out. It was a relatively small number compared to the slaves that were there. But she also did a lot of speaking. One of my favorite stories about the two of them when they were on stage together was during a rally. At one time, Frederick Douglass was speaking and basically saying there's no hope. We've got this system, and it seems like we're in despair. And quietly, Harriet Tubman spoke from her seat on the platform and said, "Frederick, is there no God?" But that was pretty good. Her faith was in God. She had faith that God would bring about a change. And of course he did. All right, so those are two of the heroes of abolitionism. We could also talk about people that were we're going to find involved later with also evangelism, like Charles Finney, the Tappan brothers, the Welds, Garrett, who had the newspaper that was pro-abolition, and then of course we have the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. All those had a great effect on promoting abolition of slavery. All right, and we're going to be reading about that later when we talk about slavery, reading about those issues, those people. Any questions or comments about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman? Okay, the next innovation comes in education. Now, prior to this time, education was handled by whom? Who was responsible for education, the education of children? Parents were responsible, so many parents, especially if they were outside of a community on a farm, they would educate their own. And that in South especially, where people lived far apart, parents educated their own children. Who else might be involved in educating?
Tutors and nannies.
Tutors and nannies. So you might hire someone to tutor your children. Was there any situation in which children were gathered together for education in a town or city? Who would have done it then?
The teacher.
They could have hired a teacher to do that, but it was up to the people of the town, right, to hire a teacher. And many times, in a local community, the teacher of the children during the week would have been the pastor of the church. So the point I want you to understand is that Christianity was very much tied in. You remember when the Pilgrims and the Puritans first arrived, they valued education so strongly that they passed a law saying that every community has to have a school. And you know the name of that? Well, not the official name, but you know what they called that law? They called it the Old Deluder-Satan Act. Because in the law it said, in order to prevent our children from being deluded by Satan, deceived by Satan, we want to make sure that they know how to read and write, that they can read, that they're educated. So they saw education as a buffer against Satan. And so it was assumed by most that when you were educating with Christian principles in mind and from the Bible. In fact, I don't know if I have a picture of him, I think in a few minutes, but the most famous group of readers that was developed was McGuffey's Readers. Have you ever read any of McGuffey's Readers? Some homeschoolers still use them, I think, although they seem to have passed out of popularity. But they were used for a long, long time. And many of the stories that children read in those came from the Bible or had biblical principles and morals attached to them. Well, with all that background, I'm taking you to a man whose name is Mann. Horace Mann is known as the father of public education. And I notice even in Christian textbooks I've read, they talk in glowing terms of Horace Mann. But what was Horace Mann's purpose in making sure that children were educated? His purpose was to get rid of Christianity. And so I don't glorify him. I don't say he was a great man for bringing education. We had education. He just wanted to change it to totally secular. He wanted to get rid of the Christian aspect of education. And so he was behind the move beginning in Massachusetts to pass a compulsory education act. You know what that means? Compulsory education? That means every child is compelled to go to school. They have to go to school. Now you might say, well, that sounds like a good idea. But is it the state government's function to force children to go to school? It's up to the parents, right? Now, and what they mean by that is, not homeschooling anymore, not schooled by the pastor. No, it has to be a school in which the teachers have a license to teach, which they have to get by going to a government-run institution or college. So you see they're gaining control of all of education. They're forcing children to go to school, and the schools are controlled by these anti-Christian humanists. And the only way that a teacher can teach there is by getting educated in their government-controlled colleges. You see how they were gaining control? Now, the control that they hoped for did not happen as soon as they thought it would. It took a long time. But if you know anything about education in our country today, you can see that they finally succeeded. It took a lot longer than they thought. But look at what he says here, and you get an idea of his attitude. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education, he calls it the sacred cause. He doesn't believe in God, but this is a sacred cause, are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. What's their cause? It's an anti-Christian cause. It's a socialist cause, a humanist cause. And the children are hostages. And we could look at a lot of other quotes from educators then and since then that talk about how we have to get rid of the values that our children are taught by their parents and re-educate them, redirect them. All right, so that's the beginning of public education or government-run schools. Next person that we want to talk about in area of education is Noah Webster. Noah Webster is probably most known by you as the person who wrote the first American dictionary, but that was not the most important thing at the time that he did, or nor the first thing. The first thing he did was write a spelling book. And it had a blue cover on it, so it was called a Blueback Speller. Now, he had to go through a lot in order to get that distributed. There were no educational publishing houses. He had to publish himself. He would have to go into different cities. He'd go to Philadelphia, find a printer, arrange a payment to him to print a certain number of his spellers. And then he would go out into the different schools or churches and convince people that this was a good thing for their children to have. And so he is the author, he is the publisher, and he's the salesman. And he's going from city to city trying to promote this speller. And one of his purposes was to have, because people spelled words a lot of different ways. And if you look at any documents written in the 17th, 18th centuries, you'll see spellings that are different from how we spell today. But sometimes, even in the same document, you'll see them spell a word differently than they did earlier. Spelling was not considered very important. He thought it was important that Americans have a way of spelling that made sense. And so the reason you see words like color in the British world spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, and we spell it C-O-L-O-R, is because Webster said that U doesn't really need to be there. So he took the U out of a lot of words like that have OU. So most of the spelling differences we see between the British world and the American world are due to Webster trying to codify an American system of spelling and pronouncing words. And so he had a great influence in education through his Blueback Speller. And then his interest in words led him to then write a dictionary. His dictionary is still considered one of the best ever. Many people refer to it rather than to modern dictionaries because in his selection of words, he gives more meanings of words than we find in a lot of our dictionaries today. And also gives examples, and many of the examples he gives are from Scripture. Now, of course, he doesn't have modern words in it, but any words that have been in usage for a long time are there. And if you'd ever like to look up a word in that dictionary, it's on the podium right back there. Mr. Harrington was kind enough to give me that dictionary, so anytime you need to look up something and you want to get a full range of definitions, that's the place to go. All right, any comments or questions about Noah Webster? Don't confuse him with Daniel Webster. That's a different guy. All right. Next we have McGuffey that I mentioned before. He taught in Poland, nearby. He wrote the McGuffey Readers, which were used extensively throughout the United States for many, many years. I'll tell you a little something about McGuffey. A wide range of material, from Aesop's fables to Bible stories, a lot of different things in there. There was a Harvard college professor, this was probably 20 years or so ago, and I think the illustration would probably be even worse today. But he had a group of freshman law students that he gave them a portion to read out of Blackstone's Law. Now, Blackstone was an English author whose law books were the standard for American law for many, many years. If you wanted to become a lawyer in the United States in the 17th or in the 18th century, 19th century, you had to be familiar with Blackstone's Law. Well, they came back the next day and he asked them how it was, and they indicated how difficult it was to read Blackstone's Law. He then told them that what they had so much difficulty with as law students in college was, it was from Blackstone's Law, but it had been lifted directly out of McGuffey's 6th grade reader. So that might give you an indication of how education standards have gone down over the years. Any comments about McGuffey? The original schoolhouse he taught in Poland is located now in Greenfield Village near Detroit, along with Firestone's Farm is also there. They took it from Columbiana up to Greenfield Village. Have you ever been to Greenfield Village? I don't hear anybody going there much anymore, but it's a neat place. Next we have Dorothea Dix. I think you read about her in your book. She was concerned about mental health. Many people with mental health problems were treated like animals. They didn't know what to do with them. You know, if somebody was acting crazy, they would just chain them up. In fact, that was even true of Patrick Henry's wife. His wife went crazy, and he didn't know what to do with her. In order to protect others and herself, he chained her in the cellar and took food down to her for years. And it might sound terrible he did that, but there wasn't any place to put a person. And he lovingly cared for her. Dorothea Dix established hospitals for people to be put in institutionalized who were mentally ill. Then we have the temperance movement. This is a famous sign that they used: lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So it's mostly women driven to get rid of alcohol. They saw alcohol as a culprit in society, bringing about a lot of maladies. And so the move was to get rid of alcohol. Now, interesting, the word temperance itself means what? If you're temperate, what are you?
Like right in the middle.
Yeah. So we're told that one of the fruit of the Spirit is temperance, at least in the King James Version. I'm not sure how it's translated in more modern ones. Temperance simply means to not be an extremist. And in Great Britain, the temperance movement was designed toward getting people to not get drunk, not overdo it. But in America, the temperance movement was total abstinence, no alcohol at all. And eventually, that becomes national law through an amendment to the Constitution called Prohibition. The women also were involved in what's called women's suffrage. Suffrage indicates the right to vote. So they had rallies, and a lot of times they overlap, and some of the speakers overlap between advocating temperance and advocating women's right to vote. Any questions or comments about that? One of the first national meetings that was held for women's suffrage was in Salem. This one is in Seneca Falls, in New York. Next, there were groups that, religious groups that came into existence attempting to bring about heaven on earth. They thought the way to do that was to have a community of people that were working together, living together, and there were different degrees as to how much interaction they had. And some of these groups, like the Rappites, named after their founder, some of them would not allow sexual relations at all. So even if you came in as a married couple, no more. Some of them did allow marriage and family. Many of them did not, but they shared everything communally. So whatever they worked for, they shared, and that never works for very long. The Pilgrims tried it, the settlers at Jamestown tried it, and it doesn't work. And all these groups eventually fell apart. Some of them became involved in industry, so that different communities would get good at making something. Like Oneida, New York, there was a community there, and they became good at making Oneida. That's silverware, I think. And so they manufacture that. There's I'm trying to remember what's the name of that. It's a town in Indiana. I can't think of it. It became eventually became appliances. So, what? No, not Muncie. There's another name. I'll think of it later. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the arts. The arts developed in America. Now, prior to this, if you wanted good artwork, you'd have to send from overseas to get it. Benjamin West is one of the first Americans to really develop an art as an American. This is a painting that he did, and you can see it's very realistic looking. Here's another one. This is William Penn's treaty with the Indians. So he painted historical events a lot of times. Gilbert Stuart became a well-known portrait painter. He painted these well-known portraits of George Washington. And also this one of Jefferson. And you've seen those portraits of them. They're on money, they're coins, they're people's houses. John Trumbull was another painter, and here are his portraits of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Again, very famous portraits. Architecture became something that Americans got more and more interested in as well. Here's what the U.S. Capitol looked like in 1846. So that is not, that's within 50 years of when it was built and when the country started. And so you can see it's a pretty good example of fine architecture, and especially trying to copy sometimes Greek, sometimes Roman styles. One who was really interested in architecture was Thomas Jefferson. This is his home in Monticello. And he incorporated a lot of different architectural designs in his house. This is another painting by George Caleb Bingham called Stump Speaking. It's common back in those times, if you wanted to gather a crowd to listen to you, you just get up on a stump somewhere, some kind of platform, and people come around and listen to you. This is another one by George Caleb Bingham called The County Election. Now, elections back then were not done in secrecy. You would walk up to the place where they were taking the ballots, and you would tell them out loud who you're voting for. And the candidates might be standing right there. Some of them might be offering some free liquor before you voted, or maybe even after you voted. So it was known as a time for kind of partying. And if you voted for a guy and the other guy was standing there, he might start criticizing you for your vote. Why'd you vote that way? You're no longer my friend, All kinds of things could happen. So you can see why eventually a secret ballot was determined to be the way to go, and also no sale of alcohol on election day. Some good literature comes out of this time. The Last of the Mohegans. written by James Fenimore Cooper. Anybody ever read that? Oh, that's a great book. It tells about this frontier man who, his name is Hawkeye, and his adventures in the woods. He has a couple of friends who are Mohican, the last two Mohican of the Mohican tribe. It takes place during the French and Indian War, so he gets caught up in being captured by the French and fighting for the British, and there's romance there with the colonel's daughter and all kinds of things. So I think it's a really good book. Another one, written at the time by Washington Irving, is called The Knickerbocker's History of New York. And in that book, you find stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Have you ever read that? You've not read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow? About the Headless Horseman? Also, Rip Van Winkle. You ever read that? A man who falls asleep for 20 years. Oh, man, you guys need to read. These are classic works in American literature. Washington Irving also wrote a biography of George Washington, and as far as I can tell, is the first one to include the story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. We have some philosophers coming on the scene and authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I think you've probably heard of, maybe read something of him in literature. There's Henry David Thoreau. They both lived in Massachusetts. We have authors like Walt Whitman, who wrote Leaves of Grass. And Nathaniel Hawthorne becomes a very prolific author. Most famous work is The Scarlet Letter. Are you reading that in class, or will you read it in class? Used to. Someone in class used to read it. Has anybody read it? It's a very good work. Also, he wrote House of Seven Gables. He's a good author. Another author that is very interesting is Edgar Allan Poe. Have you read anything by Poe? Yeah, he wrote a lot. The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, a short story, one of my favorites. He also had a softer side. He wrote a poem that I really like called Annabel Lee. It's a love poem. Doesn't seem to fit in with her. Oh, another great story he wrote, the Cask of Amontillado.
Oh yeah.
That's a really good story.
That's scary.
What?
Scary.
Yeah. And what's the other one?
The Raven.
Of course, the Raven. Yeah, I gotta forget that. Baltimore football team, after they left Cleveland, named themselves the Ravens after Edgar Allan Poe because he happened to have died there. I mean, he didn't live in Baltimore very long, but that's where he died. And so I guess it couldn't be any more creative than coming up with Ravens based on a guy who lived there for a little while and died. He died a drunk, penniless. He died in the gutter. Stephen Foster, one of the greatest songwriters of American history, and unfortunately, most people don't know his songs today. Here's a medley of his songs. See if you recognize any of them. Whoops. Go back. Recognize that song? Sing along if you like.
The day I left, the weather it was dry. The sun so hot, I froze to death, and it was goodbye. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. When I come from miles and away, I feel like my feet. Susanna, don't you cry for me. When I come from miles and away, I feel like my feet. You
heard that song? Now, back then, there were no recordings. So you wrote a song, the only way you could make money from it is by selling the sheet music. So a song would become popular, people would buy it, and they would sing it in their homes. They may sing it on a stage somewhere, but people could want to sing in their homes. Gather around the piano or with a banjo and sing these songs that were written by Stevie Foster. Hear that song? I don't know if we'll get to it before the bell rings. One of my favorites that he wrote was Beautiful Dreamer. I was playing that on the piano lessons.
Well,
You've heard that one before.
See the blue?
All right, Stephen Foster, great American songwriter.
I saw a video. The whole thing was just him saying,
Maybe tomorrow. Song was written
I came with the 30. Are we supposed to turn in our corrected tests?
I forgot to get them from you, so.